Bore da pawb. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this winter lecture from Professor Miles Richardson on transforming nature connection. My name is Joe Roberts. I'm a lead specialist advisor on outdoor access and recreation for Natural Resources Wales, and also a member of the ORN executive committee, and I will be chairing the meeting today. So I just want to welcome you all. I can see the numbers flying up at the moment, so it's really great to see so many people in the room this morning. Also, welcome to ORN members and also non-members. I think it's really great to see people that we've maybe not connected with before coming in to engage with us on this really important and thought-provoking topic. So just quickly, for those who don't know the ORN, we're a network of organisations that manages and promotes recreation across the UK and Ireland, with a shared vision for encouraging more people to enjoy and engage with the outdoors. And I think this lecture today and this theme is really important to us as a community, as a sector, and as recreation managers. The ORN has acknowledged this with one of our kind of core priority themes in our action plan being transforming nature connection. And this is one of the first sort of conversations that we've hosted about it. So I'm really excited to see what this brings up and maybe where it will go in future. I think as recreation managers, we're at the forefront of getting people outside in nature, but the challenges that we face today are not the same as the challenges we faced 30 years ago or even 3 years ago. The whole way of being for our society is influenced more and more by a digitized kind of society, digitized communication, and as an example of this, online ways of working. We're still learning about the ramifications of this. And the question that I have often posed myself in the work that I do is whether or not it's enough to work in the way that we've always worked around public access to nature, or if we do need to totally rethink the way that we see our role in connecting people to nature. And I think it's this space of contemplation that I hope we can open up today. I hope where we can experience Miles's lecture, but also really contemplate and come back and engage with those topics that he's going to present. We're in really good hands with Miles in posing some of these challenging conversations, and I hope you will really engage with the conversation and the questions after with your own thoughts. So before I introduce Miles, I'd just like to do a few points of housekeeping. So during the lecture, please turn off your mic and turn off your camera to help with bandwidth. We are recording the event and it will be made available to ORN members and those who have joined this webinar. So we'll share some of those points later, so you'll be able to know how to access it at a later date. And also, as we go through the lecture, please use the chat pane and the Q&A section to provide questions or considerations or thoughts, and we'll pick up that after the lecture for a more open discussion. So just to introduce Miles before we hand over the mic. For those who don't know Miles, Miles is a chartered psychologist, a chartered ergonomist, and a professor of human factors and nature connectedness at the University of Derby. He founded the award-winning Nature Connectedness Research Group, which aims to understand and improve connection to nature and to unite both human and nature well-being. The group works closely with Natural England, and it has also been adopted by many other organisations, including the National Trust, the RSPB, and was forefronted in 2021 Mental Health Awareness Week. Miles is also the creator of award-winning Biodiversity Stripes and the lead author of the IPBES Global Transformative Change Assessment. His new book, Reconnection, Fixing the Broken Relationship with Nature, was published in April 2023. I think we move on to a slide about that book. Great. I would encourage it. We very kindly have a discount for purchasing the book. I would recommend it. I wish I'd have seen this before, but I'd already downloaded the audiobook, and I'm not sure if this is actually in keeping with the connection to nature, but I've been listening to it as I've been gardening. So there's a question about that. Maybe it's I'm not using my senses enough in those moments, but it is a really stimulating and thought-provoking read or listen, and it is really interesting to try and sort of place our own sector of recreation management within the thoughts and challenges presented by Miles. So I will now, without further ado, pass over to Miles, who will set the scene and give us some food for thought for these conversations. Diolch, Miles.
So, thank you very much for the introduction and the mention of the book as well. Always very welcome. I will share my screen. I'll also turn my camera off just in case there are any kind of Wi-Fi issues. I'm currently up in the garden, so it's a long way from the hub. So as I was saying, transforming our connection with nature, and it's split around the 3 parts that are also in the book. And there's one of the quotes that I found while I was researching the book that I thought was quite interesting, how the perspective that there's a single underlying fault upon which the entire edifice of Western thought and science has been built, namely that we're separate from nature. So the story's very difficult and quite depressing, I'm afraid, for the first few slides. I sadly kind of come to the conclusion that our relationship with nature is broken. Sometimes I say failing, and that's obviously a generalization, particularly for the Western world. But there is as we'll come on to, there is a global perspective that our relationship with nature is failing as well. So you'll notice from these pictures that we have climate warming, that's the school strikes. We have biodiversity loss represented there by the dead bee, and we have mental health crisis as well, which I also think can be linked through to our relationship with nature. And the 4 minutes 36 seconds there is just from a research study that we did in Sheffield, where we tracked people using their mobile phones around the city of Sheffield, and 4 minutes 36 seconds was a median amount of time that people spent in green spaces during a typical day. So not very much at all. And another representation, the biodiversity strikes were mentioned in the introduction. They're paired here with the climate warming strikes, which you would have seen, and they show a very sad situation, which is during my lifetime and many of our lifetimes from 1970 through to the present day, 69% loss of wildlife globally. And another sign of our disconnection and our failing relationship with nature is perhaps could be seen by the amount of time and research that we spend looking at people's the benefits that nature brings to people. So we over the past few decades, we've probably spent millions of pounds trying to prove that nature has health benefits for people, but we would never ask that question of whether a fish needs a river or a bird needs the sky or an ape needs the forest. But we do question whether people need the natural world, which is the home of our evolution and for the majority of our kind of species existence. Another sign of our disconnection can be seen in our cultural products. So this is just a chart from a research paper that looked at nature-related words in English fiction. And it shows how nature is declining in our kind of cultural life. You can see there from the kind of 1950s, the nature words start to drop, quite a steep drop as well in the kind of 50s and early 60s. That's also reflected in song lyrics as well, which is kind of quite interesting. and this is a chart that I put together. So the green line is the loss of biodiversity since 1970. That's a global figure. The loss in the UK is not so much since 1970 because we're ahead of the game. Sadly, a lot of our biodiversity was lost before 1970. But the red line is the use of the word me. So that's a Google engram of simply the use of the word me in our written words, and it just shows how the loss of biodiversity has come along at the same time. How we're increasingly interested in ourselves, and that's captured quite nicely by that cartoon there by Ralph Underhill, which captured it very well, sadly. And the final challenging thing, I've not introduced what nature connectedness is yet, but this is kind of needed in the introduction. This is a kind of league table of European nations, and it includes nature connection. You can see there. The UK is bottom of this group of countries that were included in this research study. You can also see that we're towards the bottom for biodiversity, and we're towards the bottom for well-being. And I think this challenges the notion that we're a nation of nature lovers. We have a rich heritage of landscape artists depicting the natural world and poets who cherish the natural world, and more recently our nature documentaries are sold around the world, and we think of a green and pleasant land, but we live on one of the most nature depleted countries on the planet. I think in the bottom 12 out of 190 nations, and our nature connection is very low as well. So the UK is in a bad place, but there's global recognition that generally people have a failing relationship with the natural world, and these are just a few examples of the reports and the bodies that are now talking in terms of our failing relationship with nature and how a sustainable future requires a new relationship with the natural world. So you can see there the UN, there's a UN evidence review there, the Stockholm Plus 50, which was last year, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there was an interesting briefing from the European Environment Agency earlier this year that talks about our failing relationship with nature, which is quite new language in the European context. It's not so common in Europe as it is around the world. And I kind of like to take the long view on this as well, and this is something I consider in the book. Why has this happened, and how has this happened from a time there on the left? You can see where we would have spent hundreds of thousands of years probably deeply embedded in the natural world, understanding the natural world as hunter-gatherer societies and the like. And then as time moved on through agricultural, scientific, industrial and technological revolutions, we now find ourselves where we spend most of our time indoors in a deeply embedded nature, in a deeply embedded relationship with technology, basically. Technology is perhaps overtaken from nature in that terms of relationship. And while the outside world, outside of our rooms, is in decline with the loss of habitat and climate warming as well. So we have these two massive issues in terms of climate warming, the need for greener consumption and using less fossil fuels, and yes, less plastics and aspects like that. And we also need to restore nature. And there's obviously a great focus on that. And I would say that they're treating the symptoms of a broken relationship. And sometimes treating the symptoms isn't always the full cure. And so the cause, which is seen in those UN reports increasingly, is the need to restore our relationship with nature. If greener consumption and habitat restoration are going to stick and going to work most effectively, we need to renew our relationship with the natural world as well. But after that very depressing introduction, there is hope. There are hidden connections, even if we might not realize it. We're all got deeply embedded connections to the natural world, and these pictures on this slide just illustrate that. So we have a bunch of flowers there. If you put people in a laboratory and put various sensors on them to measure their things like their heart rate variability, you will see a response. Just 3 minutes looking at flowers can calm the nervous system, and you can detect that change physiologically. There's an actual change in the body when you start to look at flowers. And that same effect can be found if you do a similar kind of analysis of someone sat or standing in a woodland, which might be kind of you more likely to recognize that feeling. And then in quite a magical way, if you just blindfold people and place them in a laboratory and ask them to place the palm of their hand on various materials, you get those physiological effects and the calming of the nervous system only when the palm is placed on oak, so natural materials such as oak. So the body intuitively knows when it is connected to nature, which is quite an amazing thing. And the other little icons there's the microbiome. Lots of exciting research at the minute of how the microbiome and the good microbes out in the natural world are important for our well-being. And it's interesting that a recent paper that I read recently showed that even though woodland has more microbes in it, it has fewer pathogenic microbes than a football pitch, for example, or a park. They're inherently healthy places to be, and some of our grasslands and green spaces aren't as healthy. And the picture of the brain there just shows that the amygdala, which is involved in processing our emotions, benefits when people grow up in or near urban woodlands. So you can see these hidden connections that we have with the rest of the natural world that we perhaps don't recognize, and perhaps need to be more common knowledge to show the benefits of nature to people in our models of well-being. For example, we don't talk about nature enough. So those physical connections to the natural world bring us to our psychological connection, our emotional connection, and our cognitive connection to the natural world. And that is defined in psychology as nature connectedness. So it's an internationally recognized psychological construct that's different to contact and exposure to nature. So that's the kind of really important thing to remember. And it's our sense of relationship with nature, both the cognitive one, whether you feel and believe you are part of the natural world, and an emotional one, whether you have a strong bond to the rest of the natural world. And because it's a defined psychological construct, we can measure it with psychometric scales. We can do some science, and we found that you can change it. You can design interventions to change it, and you can provide evidence to decision makers that yes, nature connectedness is a good thing that can unite both human and nature's well-being, which I think is a really important area of focus just now. So when you can measure it, you can produce charts like this, so you can start to understand it a bit more, rather than just being some abstract concept. You find that nature connection, as you can see, decreases rapidly in the early years towards the teenage years, where it bottoms out around 13, 15, and then increases slowly back, so that the overall mean is around 61. This is from a 2016 study in the UK. So that's the teenage dip. Recently I've kind of reflected on that trend line there. If you carried it back to zero, because obviously you can't measure nature connectedness in a newborn or very early years, but if you just extrapolate that out, it reaches 100, which is the maximum score, around zero. And it dawned on me that perhaps we're perfectly connected to the natural world when we're born, and then our kind of culture disconnects us gradually over the years. So that's quite important to think of. Rather than connecting children to nature, perhaps we ought to stop disconnecting them from nature. So that's the introduction to our failing relationship with nature, but the innate connections that remain and give us hope, and our psychological relationship with nature, and the science of nature connectedness, which allows us to look at the benefits of reconnection. So the next part is just looking at those benefits. And another quote from the book there, which I didn't know and was kind of quite amazed at the time. I've talked about microbes and microbial cells. Each one of us is a community of half human and half microbial cells. We are only 50% human cells. So the benefits of nature connectedness are basically around feeling good and functioning well. So feeling good, you can see in the yellow text around the outside there, things like vitality, happiness, are feeling good. And then functioning well is having meaning and purpose in life, satisfaction with your life, personal growth, and feeling that your life is worthwhile. And there's some other benefits that you wouldn't particularly expect, like pro-social behavior and more positive body image and lower anxiety. But around the feeling that your life is worthwhile, which is obviously an very important aspect of well-being, in the study we did back in 2020, we found that nature connectedness explained 4 times as much of the variance in people's feelings of feeling worthwhile, that their life was worthwhile, 4 times more than socioeconomic status, which is a kind of benchmark measure as accepted that that's important in whether your life feels worthwhile. And in that particular study, measured in tandem, the number of nature visits wasn't significant, which can be quite surprising. But that highlights the difference between connectedness and visits. And then the other aspect is that nature connectedness is related to doing good things for nature. So systematic reviews have found a strong and robust link between nature connection and pro-environmental behaviours as well. And just to kind of highlight that in simple terms, I mentioned that the mean level of nature connection on this scale towards 100 was 61. In terms of pro-nature behaviours, people who report doing nothing for nature had a nature connectedness level of 47. People who did a little bit, i.e. just recycling, that's pretty easy, doesn't require much effort, they had a level of nature connectedness of 63. And people who did conservation volunteering, which obviously takes some commitment, had a nature connectedness level of 76. So you can get this broad picture of, as you increase your relationship with nature, you're likely to do more for nature. And so we have this kind of virtuous circle of good for nature, good for you. Human exposure, visits, access to nature is important. It will bring well-being benefits, but repeated human engagement with nature and connection will also have that reciprocal benefit of doing more for nature, creating more nature to enjoy, and perhaps bring some additional benefits from from exposure alone. And I think in the context of today's talk, that's really important, because a big focus is quite rightly access. There needs to be equitable access to nature, but sometimes I think we can get caught up in focusing on what's easy to measure. And there's research out there that shows that increasing opportunity to access nature doesn't necessarily increase orientation to visit and engage with nature, and it doesn't particularly have a strong effect on pro-environmental behaviours as well. And I think at this time we need to make sure that our actions and programmes are good for people and good for nature too. And in another study, nature orientation was found to be the most significant factor in the use of green space, ahead of perceived accessibility. And they even found that when green spaces were as close as 250 metres to people's homes. And as I say, I wonder whether this is because access, visits and time are straightforward measures that can be seen to be objective. And there's a quote there from a recent paper I read, that using them just because they're countable is quite a subjective decision. We see them as objective measures, but does that lead to us simply making plans and designing activities and policy that follows what's easy to measure? And that prompts the question, how do we measure, promote orientation or emotional access or nature connection? I think you can kind of talk about orientation to access nature and emotional access and nature connection in the kind of same, they're bound up in the same construct in a way. And this led me to reflect and produce these kind of indicative charts. These are informed kind of by the research, but they're not specifically related to one research study. But I think it just helps reflect on the activities that we do broadly and the work that we do broadly. So on the left, we have a wide dispersed cloud of blue dots, and that's just basically reflecting that access to local green space and access to nature is not as good as it should be for many people, and we need to tighten and increase that distribution so that more people have got more local green space and engage with that green space a bit more. And that's reflected by the blue arrow on the right chart. So we're trying to focus that distribution of people, give more people access to nature. But then I kind of think about pro-nature actions and wonder whether we should be aiming for the green cloud. So at the same time as we increase local green space and access and visits, we're building a connection with nature to increase pro-nature action and pro-nature behaviours. And perhaps the blue arrow is, in a way, is more of the same in terms of more of our current relationship with nature, rather than creating a new relationship with nature, which, as we've seen in the earlier slides, is really important. And this slide is just another way of looking at that. So the UK is currently poor for nature's well-being, low levels of biodiversity, poor for human well-being. We're at the bottom of that table that you saw earlier. And which way we're heading? Are we focused on human well-being, improving the blue arrow? Are we heading down the green arrow? Or are we going to try and navigate that kind of blue and green arrow, which to me is heading for a new relationship with nature that unites both human and nature's well-being? And then finally on the research, and it kind of just the very latest from 2023, these are all systematic reviews that show that there's confirmation that people's psychological and physical connections to nature have declined over time and continue to decline over time. That in a review of current practice, it recognised that human nature connection is an important target, but has yet to become mainstream in practice. And there's also another systematic review that recognised nature connection is beneficial for health and nature conservation, but it is neglected in current public policy. So it's great that it's becoming an aim and a target for organisations. So that brings us on to nature connection is important, and hopefully you recognise it's a potential good thing. How do we create a new relationship with nature? And quite often we turn to education, but the research shows that that's not a particularly great way to improve nature connection or pro-nature behaviours. And I always kind of highlight this study because it's kind of quite stark, that showed that environmental knowledge explained 2% of children's ecological behaviour, but nature connectedness explained 69%. So we need new ways to target nature connection. And one of the first things that we did was a twist on the noticing or writing down 3 good things each day. I changed it to noticing and noting down 3 good things in nature each day. So prompting people to notice and engage with nature in a very simple way. And we've run that study a few times now, and we've always found significant increases and sustained increases in nature connectedness. And in one study, we found significant increases in mental health that were sustained for a month, just from writing down the good things in nature each day for a week. Had benefits a month later that we could still detect. And it's this prompt to notice nature when we spend most of our time indoors, and to focus on moments in nature, not minutes in nature. But sadly, in work that we've done with the National Trust, we found that people don't notice nature. 80% of people rarely or never watch wildlife, smell wildflowers, or photograph nature. We did an analysis of some data that was collected during lockdown from March 2020. There was a national measure coincidentally introduced at the same time of noticing nature and visits to nature. And while it was widely reported that visits to nature had increased, because that was one of the few things that we could do, noticing nature increased more by 74% compared to 40%. And in the analysis that we did, it was those increases in noticing nature which better explained well-being than the visits to nature, and it explained more pro-nature conservation behaviours in people at that time as well. So that simple aspect of noticing nature is really important. But it's probably a bit too simple. It's a good step. But when we have a broken and failing relationship with nature, we need a design framework that can fundamentally redesign our programs and our spaces and our towns and our cities. So we've developed the Pathways to Nature Connectedness, which is basically the 5 types of activity to promote. And this can be programs that engage people with nature, or it can, as I say, it could be the design of a space, a room, a city, wherever your imagination stops. And these 5 pathways start with noticing the senses, exploring and experiencing nature through all the senses. So creating opportunities for people to have sensory engagement with nature is really important. And then beauty is one of the pathways as well. So when you're noticing nature, prompt people to kind of consider the beauty of the natural world, or make sure spaces have got access to beautiful aspects of nature. The third pathway, very important, is emotional engagement with nature, designing spaces, places, programs that allow people to feel the joy and calm of the natural world. And then a fourth pathway, also very important because it's kind of deeply cultural, from poetry through to songs and festivals and folklore, is meaning, celebrating and sharing nature's events and stories. So creating spaces and places and programs that do that. And then the final pathway is compassion, providing opportunities for people to help and to care for nature, whether that's in their own garden or in a local park or wherever. It's an important route to bonding with nature. And in that research, we also found 4 types of relationship with nature which weren't related to nature connection: the scientific study of nature, the practical use of nature, that utilitarian relationship, and the dominionistic relationship, which have probably got us into the situation we're in through exploiting natural resources on an industrial scale, and kind of obviously the negativistic. Nature can be scary and threatening and dangerous, and obviously that's not a route to connection to focus on that. And perhaps those are pathways for survival and progress rather than a rounded and sustainable relationship with nature. And in conclusion, I like to think in quite a simple way that, like elsewhere in our lives, a lasting and sustainable relationship comes through noticing, emotion, finding beauty, meaning, and compassion. And a recent research paper you can find on my blog in August, we compared interpersonal relationships with relationships with nature and found many parallels. So just a quick note on the pathways there and how they've been used. National Trust, 50 Things, we work with them on the revision of that. We're building helping the design of a biophilic school. Generation Green Influencers, 30 Days Wild, have all been informed by the pathways, as have some kind of built spaces such as the Butterfly House at Durham. And once again, those pathways are really useful, but there's also a need when our relationship globally and in this country in particular is really struggling. There's a need to focus on the macro factors and scale up to think how we can improve our relationship with nature on a big scale. And you can see this chart here. This is shows nature connectedness along the bottom and well-being going vertically. And you can see that the UK is towards the bottom for nature connectedness and well-being. And I've put a circle around those countries, all kind of English-speaking former nations of the British Empire, unfortunately. So it's kind of feels like we've got this relationship with nature that we exported, perhaps. And when you look across all these countries, you can look at the big macro factors, and it's things like income and wealth, and the amount of prosperity there is seems to be linked to a lower connection with nature. I suppose we've got other things to enjoy. The amount of technology is related to lower level of nature connectedness. Low levels of biodiversity are related to lower levels of nature connectedness. The way we use our land, the more pasture land there is, the lower the level of nature connectedness. The more urban areas, the lower the level of nature connectedness. And sadly, the more children, the lower the level of nature connectedness, which we put down to perhaps the fact that older generations, populations with older generations experienced more biodiversity in their earlier years and have a closer relationship with nature for the rest of their lives. So I won't talk about these too much, but this is just how we scale up that connection, how we moderate the red arrows, the use, control, consumption of nature, which is perhaps our failing relationship in summary, and then how we foster the green arrows, the pathways, the noticing nature, the sensory engagement, the enjoyment and celebration and care for nature, which improve nature connection and have benefits for our own well-being, pro-nature's behaviours and pro-environmental behaviours. So you have a failing relationship of climate warming and biodiversity loss, and a new relationship with a more worthwhile life and sustainable living. And we start to consider how we can use deep leverage points, they're called in the research, but it's basically, rather than having 99% of our effort, which research in this area has shown, we tend to focus on parameters and standards like providing more green space. 99% of the effort goes into policies around that, whereas changing our aims and mindsets and values and the social structures and the like provides deeper leverage. It might be more difficult to do in many cases, but you perhaps do more to improve our failing relationship by targeting those deeper leverage points. And so I think that's worth thinking about when you're trying to find ways to improve people's connection with nature is where you're aiming in terms of these leverage points. And there's much more of this in my book, but also in the information that we make freely available as well. And thankfully, this is being picked up. So this is the UN's Stockholm Plus 50 evidence review that came out last year, and that picked up on the pathways to nature connectedness and recommends that they should be used in education policy and the design of curriculums, for example. And that will be a very powerful way through education policy and curricula to have a long-term and catalytic effect on repairing our relationship with the natural world. So I'll just draw to a close now, and as I say, that's a kind of pretty light skim over the kind of top and an introduction to the whole area. But there is lots of further guidance that we've made available. Obviously, we've mentioned the book, but if you go to my blog, you can find the Nature Connection Handbook. It's over approaching 50,000 downloads now, I think. We launched the Nature Connected Organisations Handbook last month. That's proven very popular. There's a really good guide from the Mental Health Foundation to Nature Connection and policy there, and a couple of other documents you can see, and our Silk Mill vision, where we gathered and in June this year and tried to imagine a nature connected society, what that would look like. That was quite an interesting exercise, and the results of that all available from my blog. So in summary, I think sadly we have a failing or a broken relationship with nature, but I find a lot of hope in being able to focus on that relationship and the construct of nature connectedness, which helps unite both human and nature's well-being through both physical and, as I've said, most importantly, emotional access to the natural world. And I think it's really important to foster that new relationship and provide a positive vision at a time where a sustainable future seems to be giving up things, giving up our cars and giving up our gas boilers and giving up our foreign holidays, for example. This new relationship with nature provides a positive vision for a sustainable future of living with rather than without. And that's me done. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Miles. That was, as I imagined, incredibly kind of thought-provoking and a really good challenge, I think, to our sector. Just appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this morning.
No, you're very welcome.
We have now some time. It looks like we have just around a quarter of an hour, maybe. We could push that for questions and answers. There's some really good questions already in the chat. I am going to, just because I'm chairing this, so I get the chair's prerogative, I'm going to ask one question and then I'm going to go into the sort of chat questions. I find this kind of idea of the differences in our cultural understanding of nature and our cultural connection to nature, particularly the sort of divide between the global north, global south, and our relationships to nature in that way, really fascinating. But I wonder, as recreation managers, should we be really considering the cultural differences in the way that we experience and relate to nature at a site-based? I'm considering, you know, Outdoor Recreation Network represents organisations across the UK and Ireland where we have different countries, different cultures, different languages, and also we represent different communities within those countries that have very different cultural experiences of nature. So the question is, you know, how do we sort of try and, do we need to consider this, and maybe how do we bring this into our thinking as recreation managers?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think we have a lot to learn from other communities, and I think it's important that in a way we, rather than inviting people into our current relationship with nature, which isn't very strong, we look and open more widely to other communities to consider their relationships with nature, and perhaps look for the kind of closer relationships with nature that they may have, and that might inform our relationship with nature. So I think it's obviously very important, and obviously it's acknowledged in the book. There's a massive generalisation in that Indigenous peoples and communities are generally still have a more harmonious relationship with nature, but the kind of Western worldview has been exported, and it has spread around the globe to kind of quite a dominant aspect. So it's obviously important to remember that, but perhaps reflect on how some of those worldviews can be fostered in our society, in our technological society, I suppose.
That's great, thank you. Well, so there's a question from Fiona, which I think is related to that, and again about our practice as recreation managers. And Fiona outlines the kind of loving the kind of three things to notice, you know, centering that kind of noticing Ray, but asks about how we actually engage with audiences from cultures that or communities that are the harder to reach or are more underrepresented within our kind of management, and how do we sort of reach out to those who we see as not actually accessing the kind of provision that we're trying to create currently, as well with these interventions.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the big issue, isn't it? And there's a lot of focus around that in terms of access and kind of more physical access, but there's less on that in terms of our psychological access, emotional access. But I think what we learned from our silk mill vision that I briefly mentioned, where we all gathered and tried to imagine a more nature connected society, it was a really useful exercise. But we gathered people like me and people like us. We didn't reach out to communities, and we've kind of thought that what our plans are, that was a kind of test exercise to kind of envision a more nature connected society. We want to take that exercise worked, and we want to take that exercise out into different communities and produce new visions. And I think that for transformative change, visions are really important, because they provide a place that we might go to, and a place that people can get behind. And I think it can help identify barriers, but I think as well as identifying barriers, it's really important to identify solutions and targets. So I think that visiting and engaging with communities who perhaps, and working to engage with them, the ones that we're perhaps not engaging with as much as we wish we were, and to hear their voices and their stories is really important, and a really fruitful way of perhaps finding some new ways to a new relationship that we might not have thought of ourselves.
That's great, thank you. I'll just also remind the floor, I'm not sure if we've been able to do this with the technology, but your mics should be enabled now. So if anyone would like to ask a question in person, then you can do by raising your hand, and we can sort of give you the mic to ask a question directly. I have there's quite a few questions coming up around this kind of the dip in connection to nature around sort of the teenage years. And there's a question, first of all, there's a question by so whether or not it's predicted that connection to the teenagers today will increase at the same rate as the graph, even though the opportunity to connect with nature is lower than previous generations. So is there as a kind of an idea that graph will stay static, or that will change as the generation progresses?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I suppose as a relatively recent measurement, we probably don't know. I mean, there was that review, that there was a global review that found that nature connection is decreasing over time. I suppose as there's more urbanization and more technology, our nature kind of falls more into the distance, perhaps. So perhaps the line, the overall chart will decrease, but the dip might be proportionate, you know, or it might become shallow because the ceiling has come down. So yeah, I don't think we know. What we do know is that dip has been found in other populations. So there's been research in China and I think Australia and Canada and that has found that dip. And I think we can all recognise perhaps why that dip occurs. There's a lot happens during the teenage years. We start to learn how to manage our emotions and manage our relationships with our peers, and forming those friendships becomes really important. So it's understandable that nature perhaps drops out of our kind of priorities. And of course, it might be to do with secondary education and whether nature plays much of a role in that as well.
Yeah, there's a few points in the chat being raised around that. I think it's a really interesting challenge. You know, a few points being raised about the capacity within the curriculum and education. I think we're quite lucky in Wales that it's, you know, the outdoors has been centred quite well in the new curriculum. But there's a point that Taz has raised about the schools don't really have the time to devote to nature connectivity. Even in rural areas, and it is usually required by the passion of the teachers to bring it out otherwise, which, you know, these are kind of really fundamental challenges, I think, that we face. And have you any sort of thoughts, you know, on how we might address this? You know, how do we sort of really get the prominence of it up when we're talking about the curriculum?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good example where that leverage point concept I mentioned briefly, you can highlight that. So as you just mentioned, there's a bit of some movement in Wales to allow a bit more flexibility. So if you visit the Department for Education website and look at the aims of education in the UK, it doesn't include a sustainable future. It's all about things you don't expect that will have been there for decades around the quality of education, all things that are very important. But you kind of might think at this time in particular, perhaps the environmental crisis might be informing the central aims of education. And if the aims of education could be changed, or one of them added that was around environment and sustainability, that should inform the curriculum and what happens in secondary and primary schools. So that rather than aiming for small changes in policies and practices and curriculum, perhaps the aim should be to change a deep leverage point, the actual aims and the aims of education itself. And that is not a campaign I'm aware of, but
a good challenge. I'm going to bring in Mark now, who's had his hand up. It'd be nice to hear another voice and a question ringing to the space. Mark, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Miles, good to hear from you again. I had a question around the language that we use, and particularly as a conservation sector, because we're still often talking about the relationship between people and nature, or the fact that we need to connect people and nature. But should we be talking about the relationship between people and the rest of nature, and connecting people with the rest of nature? Is there a very subtle difference in the language we use that could make a big difference?
Yes, I think we do, and I'm guilty of that as well. I try and use the rest of nature when I can, but sometimes I suppose we like to shorten our messages and make them simple, but I think sometimes that can potentially undermine them, and it is a covered in the book, the importance of language and metaphors, and I kind of briefly considered during that teenage dip chart, perhaps we disconnect, you know, perhaps when we're born, we're the most connected to nature we've ever been, and we then enter a process of just picking up our culture and our relationship with nature through simple things about the way our parents and the community talks about nature. And if we're suggesting implicitly that it's separate and another thing, we grow up thinking that. And so, yes, the language we use is important, and it's a kind of very gradual drip, drip, drip through our lives that forms our worldviews.
Yeah, it's a very subtle difference, isn't it? But if we all started using the language humans and the rest of nature, then we're making it really explicit and upfront, aren't we, that we see ourselves as part of it?
Yes, no, I agree.
Thanks, Miles.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just noticing we're coming up to time now. There are a lot of very good questions. There are a lot of very good challenges. I don't think we've got enough time to go through one more, I'm afraid, or I'll be over the midday time slot. But I would like to say that there are some, in those challenges and in those questions, there is a lot of work for ORN to consider, because this is a theme that we're addressing. This is something that we're going to be thinking about further, and I would like to see this at the beginning of a conversation where we can unpack some of these things. And I really liked the idea that Miles presented of this kind of, what does this physically look like, you know, this world building exercise. And that would be an amazing thing to do for us as a sector, perhaps as an ORN event, to actually get those heads together. We represent all of recreation management across the UK and Ireland, you know, get us into one room and start thinking about what this actually looks like. So I'd like to just give a massive thank you again to Miles for coming and giving her time today. It's been an incredible lecture, an incredible sort of thing to watch as well and to engage with. So yeah, lots of love and lots of thanks being shared there. So thank you, Miles.